civil and open speech on common moral and ethical grounds with the pre-existing determination to develop solutions to common difficulties. Completely incompatible positions cannot be reconciled by the mere act of discourse, which is why the English-speaking peoples have had civil wars over values about every 80 to 120 years. There's a pattern. Since the 1380s, the restraint of free speech can rapidly lead to explosive consequences. Look back at that historical series, the 1380s peasant revolts, the 1500s, the effects of the Reformation, all of the 1600s, the English Civil War, the 1700s, the American Revolution as a central issue, the 1800s, the American Civil War, and here we are in whatever has happened since the counterculture of the 60s. Moral conflict over truth. The Constitution itself, of course, has repeatedly been referred to as a bundle of compromises. But the framers of our system were committed with that same pre-existing determination of which I speak to accomplish the organization of a functional government of sufficient but limited powers. And therein lies the difference between an idyllic principle and the practical mechanics required to establish it. In the case of the Constitution, the ideal and its functional pursuit are different. They are thoroughly complementary but different entities. We know also that the Bill of Rights was promised and then added to ultimately reconcile the anti-federalist opposition to the Constitution as originally submitted to the states for ratification. The great George Mason, George Washington's Potomac neighbor, was one of those who refused to support the Constitution because it lacked such clear and emphatic guarantees of individual liberty as were ultimately incorporated in the Bill of Rights. Mason knew that those who seek power above all else, those who are in any age essentially the enemies of human political liberty, seek every opportunity to define and restrict the terms of debate, and thus, through leverage on public discourse, legitimate free speech becomes impossible. Truth becomes either muddled in the minds of the people by the smoke screens of crafted euphemisms, or is selectively ignored, haughtily dismissed, or denied visibly by parameters imposed by media, academia, and entrenched political forces, all of which I would assert function in the moral vacuum of dedication to their expansion of power over a supposedly free people whose speech they presume to vivisect if it abrades the most minutely sensitive article of political correctness, which I choose to refer to as political infectiousness. Time, place, and manner laws, which we also encounter in any high school civics class, provide practical structural formats for the exercise of free speech and are not at issue in the public realm unless applied capriciously to deny the opportunity of speech. But when we see the ease with which academia justifies its persecution of any dissenting position, we are left to wonder whether we are in the same country anymore or whether various universities are following their speech tribunals with the issuance of their own postage. At the close of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin is famously quoted as responding to the question of what kind of government the delegates had crafted. And his answer was, a republic if you can keep it. A younger contemporary of Franklin's was the Scotsman Alexander Tytler, whose historical analysis of the rise and fall of the Athenian Republic contains a rather well-known cyclical listing of societal attributes displaying the course of human nature. I'm sure many of you have encountered the sequence. It goes like this. From bondage to spiritual faith to great courage, courage to liberty, liberty to abundance, abundance to selfishness, selfishness to complacency, complacency to apathy, apathy to dependency, and dependency back into bondage. Now, at what point in that sequence does the importance of patriotically motivated public speech begin to wane, begin to disappear, begin to become inert? Where are we in that cycle? And is that what Franklin meant about keeping a republic? Earlier I mentioned the impact on young people of a culture of progressively enforced intellectual conformity. It seems that many who have grown to adolescence after the end of the Cold War and in a supremely technological society of affluence, materialism, and innate artificiality have some difficulty in accepting the notion that history is not merely another form of entertainment to be examined exclusively for amusement. The Founding Fathers had suffered through the repressions of George III, though, and the Revolution was very real, very painful, and a very recent memory. I tell you from the marrow of my bones that one of the most difficult things to attempt to do is to try to get a contemporary American high school student to conceive of living their life without the freedoms they have always known. They cannot imagine it. Although the urgency of defining and maintaining their rights and freedoms being too often lost in an existential present. However, I would say that, quite incidentally, students do assure me that they know all about tyranny. They know all about tyranny because they say they are teenagers who have parents. Artificiality and suburban-urban detachment from the lessons of the elemental reality that predominated in an agrarian America does make the transmission of historical material more and more difficult, let alone ideals which require visualization. Occasionally, though, we see virtually tectonic shifts of pure progress. I had a junior high student this past term viewing some film about the Greek defense of Thermopylae, where, like the Alamo, free men stood in the path of the might of absolutism. And you have to follow this closely. She said with wonderment, "Are you telling us that this really happened?" I was then faced with the quandary of how to respond, and being direct and heartless as I am, I decided on a twofold response. Point one, yes, kid, history actually happened. And point two, there were actually important things before you. But in the nauseatingly careful commitment to the avoidance of any characterization, even in the historical record that is non-affirmative, another casualty does ensue, and that is a sense of humor. I have encountered blank stares and hesitant silence from students when, as an example, they hear me say that in World War II, Winston Churchill referred to Joseph Stalin as Genghis Khan with a telephone. The only comment came from